From February the 1st, it will be a year since Myanmar's military toppled the elected government and detained its leader Aung San Suu Kyi. 12 months on from the military takeover and violent crackdown that followed, the country remains in turmoil. Clashes are escalating between soldiers and newly formed People's Defence Forces, as well as some of the country's ethnic armed groups. There's no end in sight to the conflict. The violence has killed over 1,400 people so far and displaced at least 320,000. For Asian Insider this week, we're asking what's next for Myanmar. And joining us from Bangkok is our Indochina Bureau Chief, Tan Hui Yee. Hui Yee, since the military takeover in Myanmar, ASEAN has been fronting diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis. But what are the chances of a breakthrough anytime soon?
Well, it's unlikely we are going to see a breakthrough anytime soon. This is going to take time. The coup and what it triggered has aroused deep anger, and those resisting the military are not willing to consider compromise. And the military, on the other hand, is bent on subduing any opposition. There have been reports of incredible violence and cruelty. On Christmas Eve in Kaya State, for example, over 30 civilians were killed and burned. Now, ASEAN drew up its 5-point consensus to address Myanmar's crisis over 9 months ago. And since then, Myanmar's junta has pretty much ignored it. The violence has not stopped. The junta has not granted ASEAN's special envoy access to key political figures. And this includes State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, who has been detained since the coup. Given the junta's inaction, ASEAN members decided to limit Myanmar to a non-political representative at its meetings. That essentially shut out junta chief Min Aung Hlaing and his political appointees. Now, as a result, Myanmar was not represented in several summits last year. Now, Cambodia is ASEAN chair this year, and Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen has tried a different tack. He traveled to Myanmar this month to speak to General Min Aung Hlaing without setting any preconditions. Mr. Hun Sen has said he wants to draw from Cambodia's experience emerging from civil war to help bring peace to Myanmar. But it is still too early to say where this diplomacy will lead, and the junta has so far not given any indication that will honor the consensus.
Well, let's talk about the situation on the ground in Myanmar. You've just described, some instances of violence. So with fighting continuing, is there enough humanitarian assistance getting through to the people?
People are not getting enough aid. ASEAN managed to get some through to the Myanmar Red Cross last year. United Nations aid agencies and other groups are trying to reach the over 300,000 persons that have been displaced since the coup. But hundreds of thousands across the country are still without sufficient food, medicine, shelter, and clothing. And there's several reasons for this, right? There is not enough cash going around. The situation is volatile. The military appears to be delaying or denying permission for aid workers to travel to where they need. The soldiers are scrutinizing these supplies closely because they do not want them to go to the opposition. And there have been instances when they have confiscated or blocked supplies from reaching conflict zones. And conditions on the ground are very trying, Civilians have to flee when soldiers enter a town or village to avoid being taken as human shields. And when they flee, they leave most of their possessions behind. In areas where the junta is facing the fiercest resistance, soldiers are burning homes and destroying livestock and food supplies. So even when the fighting stops and they return home, people cannot resume their lives as normal. They have very little to survive on. So I was talking recently to a leader of a local community group, and she mentioned that organizing aid for these people on the run is not a straightforward affair. You may be able to give them things like blankets and tarpaulin sheets for shelter, but very often when they have to abandon these items the minute there is another raid and they need to run away, which means you have to keep giving them these same items over and over again. So what's clear from this is that, Myanmar people need a lot more aid, and the aid has to go where it's most urgently needed.
And that was Indochina Bureau Chief Tan Hui Yee in Bangkok. Thank you so much, Hui Yee. For more on what the future holds for the people of Myanmar, Hui Yee's report is available online. There's also her story on the economy, which shrank an estimated 18% last year.